I joined the New York City Department of Education 10 years ago as a math teacher. In 2008, I opened up my high school, a transfer high school in New York City called Olympus Academy, which by the time I left was implementing a fully blended model of instruction, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And in July, I joined the iZone, now the Deputy Chief of Innovation for the Office of Innovation at the New York City Department of Education. The history of the iZone. Going back to about 1992 to 2002, there had been 10 years of pretty low and stagnant high school graduation rates. So our high school graduation rate in New York City was staying at about 50% for that 10-year period. And when Mayor Bloomberg took office and former Chancellor Klein, they felt like we needed to do something better for our students. We needed to increase high school graduation rate and make sure that they were learning the skills they needed to learn to be successful. And over the next 10 years, through the Children's First Initiative, they put into place a number of reform measures that would eventually steadily improve these high school graduation rates. Included in those were giving more autonomy to principals, saying that the power should be in the principal's hands to make decisions that they need to make, where they should spend their money, who they should hire, and so on and so forth. They started, in giving the principals more autonomy to make those decisions, they started holding them more accountable, saying if you have the power to do what you need to do to be successful, then we're going to make sure you're being successful. And if you're not, there's going to be repercussions. All right, so over the next 10 years, a number of failing schools were shut down, new small schools were opened up. And what we see is from 2002, for the next 10 years, we have these steady gains in high school graduation rates of up over 20% gains over that 10-year period. And now our high school graduation rate is up over 70%. And that's fantastic for us as a city. The problem with that, though, is that there's still 30% of our students who are not graduating. And possibly even more alarming is that the data about college and career readiness. Are our students graduating ready to be successful? And so in 2011, New York City graduated over 52,000 students. But only 1 in 4 was ready to enroll in a city university and not need remedial courses. So 75% of our students were graduating needing to have remedial courses that don't count towards college graduation. And what we know about the statistics are students that enroll in college needing remedial courses, the chances of them graduating is extremely low. So what we needed to do as a city was continue the reforms that had put in place over the last 10 years, but have an organization within the Department of Ed that was focused on innovation to better personalize learning. And if we could rethink education to better personalize learning for our students, we would be much better off at meeting college and career readiness matrix. So when you think about, or when we thought about, what school normally looks like, we have this little graphic over here to the left. And our school system we basically think about there's 4 pillars of the school system. There's space and classroom design, basically where learning takes place. There's curriculum assessment and pacing, what students will be learning and when they'll be learning it. Staff and student roles, so we have our teachers as presenters of knowledge and students as receivers of knowledge. And we have programs and scheduling. So our students are programmed for a school day from 8 in the morning till 3 in the afternoon, September through June, and all the learning takes place during those hours. And this is a really good factory model of moving lots of students through their school careers, through the school day, school year, and to graduation, with very few adults necessary in the building. So every teacher could have 34 students in their classroom, and as many classrooms and teachers as we have, we could fit students, and we could get a lot of students through their school career. But as we saw from that last statistic, we may not be preparing them for college and career readiness and focusing on each individual student's needs. So what the iZone says is, let's continue thinking about those pillars of education, But what if we designed schools so that each student had those reflecting what their needs were? So space and classroom design. What if we got rid of learning needing to always take place in a room that looked like this with rows that look like this, and say maybe learning can take place in different modalities. Maybe you don't even need to be in a classroom. Maybe you could go to a library. Maybe you can go to a museum. Maybe you could even engage in activities, meaningful learning experiences from home, if given the right resources and support. We rethought curriculum assessment and pacing and said, maybe every student doesn't need to learn the same thing every day. Maybe students should self-pace through the curriculum based upon their skill set and their needs. We rethought staff and student roles. So rather than every teacher being the teacher with 30 or so students in their classroom, maybe students could control the learning experience and teachers were there to facilitate and support them as necessary. And we rethought programming and scheduling, saying that let's not limit students to 8 to 3, September to June, but let's really open up the gates so that learning can take place everywhere, anytime, and produce schedules that allow that to happen. So the iZone thought about attacking innovation on 3 levels. School level, trying to support schools in becoming more innovative schools. The market level, driving the current marketplace, especially the ed tech market, to better serve our students' needs. And the system level, thinking about the policies, the regulations, other barriers to being innovative around the large school district. Just to give some context to the size of New York City's school district, we have 1.1 million students in our district. Okay, so we're a large district thinking about all of these factors and how we improve innovation. So school level innovation. We have 2 programs within the iZone that focus on school-facing innovation. One is our iZone 360. iZone 360 is focused on whole school redesign. Thinking about those 4 pillars, space, curriculum, student staff roles, programming and scheduling, they focus on those 4 pillars trying to redesign the whole school. Important to note there, it does not mean it has to be through technology. Okay, there's schools that are doing very high-tech things in 360. There's schools that are doing no tech. It's just about rethinking the way we personalize learning for students through those 4 pillars of education. iZone 360 schools have their schools go through a design process. So plan what your school will look like a year and 2 years out. They get design and what we call component partners. So specialists in the field to help support them see their vision and make it real. They get what we call an iCoach, so a coach from the iZone to support them through implementation. And they become part of an affinity group, which is kind of like a critical friends group to get together with like-minded principals to think about the struggles and challenges of the innovation that's trying to take place. Then we have iLearn NYC. iLearn NYC is our program focused on online and blended learning. How we could use online and blended learning resources to personalize learning for our students. Talk about this one a little in depth. One focus was to bring technology to the classroom. If we could empower students, teachers, administrators to have the cutting-edge resources, online content, real-time data in their classrooms all the time, and not just in their classrooms, but make it accessible 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, we felt like we could better personalize learning. The other focus was to really unearth how we could successfully implement online and blended learning. Because what we know is that technology in itself is not the solution. It needs to be thought of as a component of a robust instructional plan. So we needed to think about how we would use those technologies and make it successful. When schools join iLearn NYC, and we currently have about 200 schools, they gain access to our learning management system. Our learning management system, or the D2L, gives access to 17 vendor courses or vendors' courses through a single sign-on. So you sign on to the learning management system, and all 17 courses are available, some for additional licensing fees and such, but it's accessible with a single sign-on. There's gradebook access for teachers. So as we think about personalized learning, and a lot of our schools are focusing on competency-based or mastery-based learning, there's a gradebook functionality there that allows for that. Reporting capabilities. One of the most important things we find about personalizing learning is to know exactly where our students are at in real time. This provides reporting capabilities that allows us to track student movement very easily. Not just what skills they're focusing on, but how many hours they're logged onto the system, what activities they were engaging in, which ones they tended to work through quickly, which ones gave them more problems, struggles, things like that. They get, additionally, an implementation manager similar to an iCoach, so someone from the iZone who's there to support them with implementation. Professional development. They're part of a lab school model, so they get to choose one of 8 lab schools. We call them lab schools, and they're our most advanced schools in the blended and online world, who they come together once a month, again as a critical friends, but also to see if there's replication possibilities for that school that they're gathering with. And the schools do receive a tiered, we use a tiered approach to provide additional resources and equipment to the schools. This is just a quick look at what the learning management system looks like. Students' courses are accessible to them once they sign on. They have a calendar, and it's pretty interactive. This is what a gradebook could look like, and that real-time data. So knowing how many attempts a student took at a single question before they got it right, and what was going on. So the iZone, 3 years ago when we started, and we've steadily have grown, and we've had more and more schools applying and a great demand to be in there. But what we really thought about was we wanted to piggyback on what was successful about New York City's reform over the 10 years prior to being there. And so we continue to provide resources, support, and time so that the principals could really be the ones that make the decision about how to innovate. We would support them through that process and guide them and provide resources, but it really continued that idea of principal autonomy. And what we saw is, if we have 250 schools in our portfolio, we saw probably 250 slightly different models of how it could be implemented. Okay? And so just to give a sense of some of the different models that appeared, Olympus Academy, which I'll talk about in more depth in a few minutes. It was my former school. I could go more in depth and like bragging about all the great stuff there. Was focused on asynchronous year-long semesters and a new teacher and student role. The New York City iSchool, what they found is that in New York City, students are required to take 5 what they call Regents exams or state standardized assessments to graduate. They need to pass 5 exams. And what they, over the course of their 4 years in high school, what New York City iSchool felt was the online curriculum could front load all the skills necessary to be really successful on those exams. And so we would use that to allow students to progress through those courses and towards those exams and pass those exams. And we would use the blended learning and the online learning opportunities after those exams to really develop a more robust, engaging learning environment. So students there can work with another school completely through online video conferencing. Students there do project-based learning. They do guest lectures they've even worked with a scientist from NASA to really engage the student in meaningful, real-life learning experiences not tied to traditional curriculum. Bronx Arena. Bronx Arena is a school that they've created an environment where their students, high school students, go to a generalist classroom. They have a single teacher in that classroom that supports them in their content and work in all courses. And they have the specialist in content areas, so maybe a math teacher, come in and work with students one-on-one rather than presenting to a whole class. So they're constantly working through the online curriculum and having push-in or pull-out services for every student. And School of One, I'm sure you heard enough about this morning, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that. So to speak about Olympus Academy and what it looked like on the ground and getting into some of the systems at play. So when we think about these pillars, space and classroom design, we donated all of our furniture, and we brought in large conference tables, comfortable chairs, much more comfortable than the ones you're sitting in right now. Put laptops at every station in front of the student, but they were movable, so the students could use pen and paper if they wanted to or needed to, but could also get online and do online experiences. We had our teachers develop all of the online curriculum. So the teachers developed online curriculum that is accessible to students 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We let them pace through the curriculum. At every stage, they need to show mastery of the work completed, and they only pass a class when they've mastered 100% of the content. Now, the courses, in New York State, there is still a seat time requirement. All courses need to be 54 hours of seat time. One of the major successes of the iZone over the years is traditionally, seat time meant physically being in a learning space with a teacher in front of you. We now see it as meaningful learning experiences that could take place through online and blended, in person, through internships. So what we were able to do is tell students they could learn when they go home from school. They could learn on the weekends. They could learn from libraries. They could learn in museums. And we would count it towards their progression in class. They wouldn't have to come back to the class and sit in the next day's lesson, the same as all the other students in the classroom who didn't engage in work at home. Engaging from outside of school actually meant something for them earning the credit and progressing to the next class. Some of the successes and highlights of blended learning that we find. The learning management system provides schools, as I said, that real-time data that makes personalizing learning much more effective. When you know exactly what your student is doing and where they're at, you could decide what learning experiences should come next. Online learning opportunities, teachers could spend less time doing things like this, standing in front, and I could be having individual conversations with each of you about what your questions are and what you're still thinking about. And when given the opportunity to learn at their own pace, students who are motivated tend to speed up the process, work towards graduation and crediting at a faster pace. Those that are not necessarily as engaged, you could focus on engagement, and you could also focus on those little skill developments that sometimes get stuck in their way for them being successful. Some of the challenges that we've come to are, this is a different world, not just for our students, but for our teachers. And we need to think about, how do we prepare teachers to teach in a world that doesn't look like the world they learned in? And so towards the end of my speech, I'm going to talk a little bit about what's next for iZone. And one of the things that's next is thinking about teacher preparation for blended and online learning. How do we define and measure success? It needs to look different if our instruction looks different. And how do we shape the market in order to get better products being made for our students in our schools? Market. As I said, we focus on the market level. Recently, back in January, we released the Gap App Challenge, it was called. This stems from wanting to improve the ecosystem of the EdTech market. What we know is historically, there's, in a system as large as New York City, there's a lot of processes and systems for everything a school wants to do. So while the principals have autonomy, there's a process to go through for procurement, for purchasing. And they tend to be restricted to companies that have large distributions and pre-made or pre-packaged products that they could show to the Department of Ed up front. And those products or solutions don't always meet our students' individual needs. So what we want to do is say, stop for a minute. Principals, stop buying what's available off the shelf. Let's name what our students' problems are and ask people or companies to create solutions specific to those challenges. And then let's think about how we make it easier to procure or purchase those items for our schools. So the Gap App Challenge is focused on, we did a lot of research on middle school mathematics, so grades 6 through 8 mathematics. And we're trying to find, is there something we could say is the problem or the greatest challenge to those students. And fractions came up a lot, and ratios and things like that. But then as we looked further into the data, realized there wasn't one specific math content challenge. The challenge was gaps in learning or gaps in knowledge that took place from their first 5 years of schooling, first 6 years of schooling. That there was just, because the way math is kind of cyclical in its curriculum, and you kind of revisit what you visited a year or 2 years earlier to learn the next skill, there needed to be a solution that focused on gaps in learning mathematics. And so we released this Gap App Challenge, and it targeted EdTech startup companies with less than 100 employees. We wanted to bring a new player into the EdTech market, small startup EdTech companies that could provide real solutions. So it was focused to those companies to develop an app that could be used in schools to improve or fill the gaps in learning knowledge in middle school mathematics. It's currently open. I think it comes to a close in mid-April, where we'll be evaluating the best that was there, and there'll be prizes offered to the winners and opportunities to pilot those products in some of our schools to see what it looks like on the ground. And finally, our system-level innovation. As I mentioned, one of iZone's big wins was getting seat time to include learning experiences that take place outside of the school building. One of the greatest, or if not the greatest barrier that I definitely found as a principal and find now in my new role, is the policies, both on a city, state, and federal level, that don't allow you to do some of the innovative things you know are right for students and that you want to do. And so one of the focuses of the iZone is to really work collaboratively across the Department of Education, with the state, with the federal government, to try to move policy restrictions. What I would say about this is it's very difficult work, it's very hard work, and we also want to remember that policies aren't going to change because we say they need to. They need to be evidence-based. There needs to be an argument for why they need to change. We need to think about working collaboratively with those, seeing policy people as our partners in this work rather than our opponents, and try to engage them in the conversations early on to see if there's space for us to try to prove that there's innovation that could take place if we remove certain barriers. And that's all for me right now. Thank you very much.